The context for our lectionary reading, the scripture for today, was that in about 580 BC, the Babylonian Empire had raided Israel, and they had taken captives, but not just any captives. They had taken the elite of Israel, the rulers, the educated, the religious leaders. They had taken the people who were the most productive out of Israel, brought them back to Babylon, and installed them in places within the palace, within the military, within business, to help their kingdom flourish. And they allowed the Israelites there to live in community, to acquire wealth, and to raise their families in relative peace and safety. And then after about 40 to 50 years of this, when many of those who had been brought in captivity have passed away, and it was the second generation, a few were still living, one of the Hebrew prophets that was in the kingdom, was in the palace, convinced the king of Babylon to allow them to return to Israel to rebuild the temple. And Isaiah finds himself in the interesting task of now trying to convince these people who have gotten comfortable, who have gotten possessions, who have gotten power and jobs that give them meaning, to go back to a land that is barren, that is being attacked by the Edomites and others, and where there's not a lot of means to have a living, and to try to rebuild the temple, and to come back, give up their power, give up their wealth, to go back for their spiritual identity, and to go back and to work alongside those Hebrews who got left behind, who were the marginalized Hebrews, who were the ones who were considered unimportant, and to go back and work alongside them. So how do you motivate people to do something like this? What is the message? And this is what he says in in Isaiah chapter 55. He says, "Come, all you who are thirsty, come to the waters, and you who have no money, come buy and eat. Come buy wine and milk without money and without cost. Why spend money on what is not bread, and your labor on what does not satisfy? Listen to me, eat what is good, and your soul will delight in the richest fare. Give ear and come to me, hear me, that your soul may live. I will make an everlasting covenant for you, my faithful promise to David. See, I have made him a witness to the peoples, a leader and a commander of the peoples. Surely you will summon nations you know not, and the nations you do not know will hasten to you, because of the Lord your God, the Holy One of Israel, for he has endowed you with splendor. Seek the Lord while he may be found. Call on him while he is near. Let the wicked forsake his way, and the evil man his thoughts. Let him turn to the Lord while he may be found, and he will have mercy on him. To our God, and he will freely pardon. For my thoughts are not your thoughts, neither are your ways my ways, declares the Lord. As the heavens are higher than the earth, so are my ways higher than your ways, and my thoughts than your thoughts. Father, may the words of my mouth, the meditation of my heart be pleasing in your sight. O Lord, my rock and my redeemer. On Thursday, I had the opportunity to speak to an interfaith group of mainly professionals over at CC Heights about prison reform. And afterwards, there was some discussion, and they asked me, well, what church are you with? What group are you with? And I mentioned Christ United Methodist Church. And one of the sisters who was there, she said, that's a church that knows how to get things done, she said. And it's true in this city. But I was thinking about that as I thought about this scripture in Isaiah, that these were a people, these Hebrews here were a people who knew how to get things done. They had the ear of the king of Babylon. They knew how to be productive. They knew how to become someone to be listened to as they worked on the Destination Babylon projects. They were productive people. They were willing to participate in the empire and to change it and to work and to also at the same time make a good life for themselves. And then right in the middle of all their busyness where the big is better and more is better, comes Isaiah, and he says to them, "Why do you spend your money on that which is not bread? Why do you labor for that which does not satisfy? Why do you use your energy on the seductions of the empire? Why do you pursue anxiety and things that may make you comfortable for a moment but will never make you happy?" And he stops them short and he says, "What are you doing? Have you been seduced? Have you lost your identity?" And that's kind of the question of Lent, isn't it? What are we doing with our endless pursuit to get ahead and not fall behind, but we find that we never reach the end. We just keep reaching for more. John Brueggemann, in his book, Rich, Free, and Miserable, The Failure of Success in America, cites a large study of children where they were asked, what's the one thing you would change in your home? What's the one thing you would like to be different? And they said, we wish our parents would be less stressed and less tired. And he goes on to say, a substantial portion of our time is devoted to work that is unfulfilling. We also allow unnecessary levels of inequality and poverty in our society. Our consumption habits include unhealthy and wasteful patterns. The urgent need to produce, to achieve, both in our jobs and all other areas of our lives, contributes to a neglect of organic social interaction. Dr. Amit Sood at Mayo's Integrative Health also found the same thing as he did his work on his book, Stress-Free Living. Thankfully, Isaiah offers us a solution, an alternative. He says, anyone who thirsts, come to the waters. Come, you who have no money, come buy and eat. Come buy wine and milk without money and without price. Listen to me, eat what is good, and you will delight in the richest fare. And he emphasizes that the richest fare is all free. It's not about meritocracy. It's not about what can I earn, how can I produce to have a little bit more than the next guy. That it's a gift, that it's free. That we would have the attitude towards all the good things as would a person who is poor or broke, who would share with the next person, you know what, I found a place, Christ United Methodist Church, where I can go and get free food, and it's great food, it's good food. That kind of an attitude, not of what have I earned, what do I deserve over someone else. So we might ask, why is it that we get so caught up, and the Israelites and all of us get so caught up in all of this doing and producing if the best things of life, as the prophet says, are truly free? Well, we know that the first half of life is about that task of establishing a home, establishing our business, establishing our wealth, establishing our family, our identity, the only platform on which we can build the only life that we have. But what takes us longer to discover, and what Isaiah is trying to get the Israelites to discover, is that there is a second task in life. And it often doesn't come until the second half of life. And unfortunately, it often doesn't come for most of us, me definitely included, until after we've had some major break in our life, some major fall in our life that makes us realize that we are what Thomas Merton calls a body of broken bones. And if we sit with that realization and we don't numb it with some kind of an addiction and we sit with it, we come to realize there is a second task in life. The first half of life is about doing. The second half is about being. And this is the task that the psalmist called us to in Psalm 63 when he spoke of laying awake and meditating in the watches of the night. It's what the prophet is calling us to when he says, forsake your consumeristic thoughts and your ways and replace them with my thoughts and ways that are higher as the heaven is higher than the earth. The prophet, the poet, is telling us that there are some of our thoughts, in fact, for me, many of our thoughts that aren't worth thinking. He says that the creator of the universe calls us to quiet not only our mouths, but quiet our thoughts, to be still and to know that I am God. Eckhart Tolle says, stillness is the language of God. Everything else is a bad translation. It's not good news for me, for a guy whose job is words, but it's in stillness, in silence, and in contemplation, and in wonder that we find what Isaiah is offering, the richest fare, that which satisfies. That truth, you say, well, that's just so simple. You just get quiet, and that's where the richest fare is? Well, it's not a simple simplicity. Oliver Wendell Holmes says, there's a type of simplicity that comes before complexity that I wouldn't give you a fig for. But there is a simplicity that comes after complexity that I would give my life for. Sometimes we have to go through a time of suffering and a time of complexity in our lives. We come out on the other side and we find that without the words, without all the complexity, there is a beauty that surpasses anything that words can produce. That's what that poem by Mary Oliver, where she says, without words, she says, the most beautiful prayers are the prayers that are made of leaves of grass. It's the very common, the very ordinary, the very simple practices of sitting in silence, of sitting and being attentive, that is the richest and the most inspiring of all experiences. The chapel at the Federal Medical Center, just a couple of miles from here, is one of the most diverse religious places that I've been. They have 15 different religions practicing there with worship services and study. And Steve, they have Santeria and Yoruba and the drumming. They have all of that going on. They have different languages. They have different cultures there. They have men of all different backgrounds and all different lifestyles. We have groups of guys that meet together that are primarily gay or transgender, and all different groups that come there to meet. But the interesting thing was, and there's over 600 that go in and out of that chapel every week, that they met separate from each other. They still could keep their separate rooms. They'd always find separate places and not come together. And when I first came there, I got to talking with Rabbi and with our Buddhist leader and some of the guys and about that phenomenon, that there was a lot of words going on, a lot of good teaching, a lot of good volunteers coming in, but we still stayed separate from each other, still were judgmental of each other. And we decided to try something. And we started something that we called interspiritual meditation, because all of those religions also appreciated silence. They also appreciated meditation in many different forms and many different shapes. But we started with an hour and a half a week of anybody of any religion or no religion could come together, not for teaching, not for words, but to sit in silence in one of our chapels there and to meditate together. And soon we had guys of all those religions and all those groups and all those identities that I just mentioned, who many of whom judged each other, some of them on the outside who had committed crimes of violence against each other because of religious reasons or because of skin color, all sitting in there meditating together, being quiet. They could join together in that spiritual practice which they all saw the value in. And then the interesting thing that we began to see is these guys who used to judge and stay separate from each other became friends, and they began to have empathy for each other and to care for each other and see, as you could sit and meditate together and then maybe share a little bit afterwards, they could trust and be vulnerable with each other. It's the most beautiful thing that you could ask to happen, which was all these religions coming together, happened, but not through words. It happened through the language of God, through the language of silence. And that's what the prophet was calling the Israelites to do, is to go and to build a place where there would be the Holy of Holies, where there would be the temple, the place where people could come in silence and to worship and to be in the presence of one who was the great I am. The great I am. And in his presence we realize not what we are to do, but we realize who we are, and we can begin to be who we are and true to our real identity. And this is what Jesus did when he went on his time into the inner room, which for him was probably a cave in the Judean wilderness for 40 days, to get quiet, to not speak, to be silent. And then, of course, out of that came his great calling to go from being an ascetic to being a foodie, to going from not eating to feasting, to going from being alone there in the wilderness to going, and everywhere you see him, he's eating The best description I've ever heard of the gospel is Jesus ate good food with bad people, or at least people they were judged to be bad. But that's what he did. He goes out and he eats and he feasts with people, and he brings in people that were the people who were marginalized, the Zacchaeuses of the world, and others who had apparently committed crimes and been marginalized, but Jesus brought them in and loved them and surrounded them with compassion and relationship, which is all what we need in the end, what he's calling us to. And this is what the prophet was calling the Israelites to do. Go back to those people who were left behind. Work alongside them. Work with them to rebuild this place of contemplation, this place of worship, and share with them the richest fare, and you will receive the richest fare. It's not in producing in the empire of Babylon that you're going to find what your true identity is. He said it's working alongside those who are marginalized, working in a difficult place, and leading them to find their spiritual identity. There's a man by the name of Sean Gordon, who I met at U.S. Penitentiary Leavenworth. Sean had been raised in San Francisco in one of the most crime-ridden areas. His father and grandfather were both gang leaders, had both been killed in gang violence. At age 14, his mother, who had been raised in foster homes, died of AIDS. But only after Sean and his sister had undergone all kinds of abuse, not only by her hands, but by the hands of other men that came in and out of the house. So age 14, Sean was unleashed. No parents anymore. And if all that he had known all of his life was that those he lived with abused him, he imagined those outside the world were much worse. So he went out with a life full of rage, of anger, and was the most ruthless, but also probably the smartest drug dealer and gang leader in the city of San Francisco at that time, bringing in hundreds of thousands of dollars. But he knew well what his fate would be. He knew what he was in for. At age 22, he purchased the most ornate casket he could and the best cemetery plot that he could, expecting to have happen to him what had happened to his father and grandfather. But God had other plans for Sean. Instead of going to the grave, he came into the federal prison system for a 12-year sentence. He came into the prison system living the same way, thinking the same way for most of his sentence, until he ran into a guy that he couldn't understand, a guy who had peace, who had a smile on his face, who was totally different. He's like, how can you be like that in prison, in the belly of the beast here? How can you be like that? And the guy invited him to come to the chapel, and that's where I had the chance to meet him. Got him involved in a community that cared for him, in a program that taught him how to do, taught him how to get a job, taught him how to handle finances, taught him those things, the first half of life things, but we also taught him how to meditate and how to pray and how to worship and how to serve, how to be mentored and how to mentor others. When Sean got out of prison, he went back to that same neighborhood in San Francisco, the Tenderloin district, in the worst parts of San Francisco. But he began to serve. He began to volunteer at the rescue mission there. He went to culinary school. When he graduated from culinary school, they said, your final exam is to serve the finest 5-course meal you can on white linens, and you can invite anybody. And at that point, he was married, had a beautiful wife. He was going to a very nice church. He could have invited the pastor, could have invited his wife. Instead, he invited 2 guys he had met at the mission, 2 scraggly, homeless guys with long beards. He invited them to come, and he served them the finest fare. And he called me, and he said, Chaplain, he said, as I served those guys, he said, they were crying. He said, there were tears running down my eyes, too, but that was just because of the onions, he said. But that was one of the richest experiences that he could have imagined in his life. And he said, tell the guys, he said, it's all about serving others. All about serving others. He said, that's the joy. All the other things, he said, I sought in my life, all the money, all the women, he said, that's nothing compared to the joy of serving that meal to those 2 men. I think Isaiah would have agreed. Jesus would have agreed. John Wesley would have agreed. And we can look at our lives and ask ourselves, am I still too immersed in the first half of life tasks? They're important. They have their place. But do I also need a time in the wilderness? A time in the inner room, a time where I can find the rhythm in which I move away from doing and move towards being, and in my being, sit and dine alongside those we used to see as the other. Amen.